Reverend clergy, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Before I begin my presentation on the Society of St. Pius V and the Thuc bishops here tonight, I have a confession to make. I have to reveal something to you. Please keep this to yourselves. Don't repeat it. I actually have three things in common with Benedict XVI. The first thing I have in common with Benedict XVI is that, like him, I am originally from Germany. So we share the same country of origin. It gets worse. The second thing I have in common with Benedict XVI is we share the same birthday. And I'm reminded of that every year. But the third thing I have in common with Benedict XVI is something I am proud of. And that is, I am not the Pope either. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Reverend clergy, we have no Pope. And because of this, we sedevacantists are caught up in all sorts of disagreements and controversies. Some of them are necessary and legitimate, and others are not. In my opinion, the controversy about the Thuc bishops is totally needless and not legitimate. It is basically a waste of time because I believe the facts are very clear. I brought you a PowerPoint presentation. And I'd like to begin the presentation by introducing you to some of the people and the events involved. So we will begin, of course, with Bishop Pierre Martin Ngoden Thuc. And there you can see a photo of him. I think I'm going to take the microphone here. Bishop Thuc was born on October 6, 1897 in Hue, Vietnam. He was the brother of Ngoden Diem, the first president of South Vietnam who was assassinated, I believe it was in 1963, during the Second Vatican Council. Bishop Thuc was consecrated a bishop by order of Pope Pius XI on May 4th, 1938, and Bishop Thuc died in the United States in Carthage, Missouri on December 13th, 1984. As far as the Episcopal consecrations of 1981, these are really the Thuc consecrations that we're always talking about. This is a photograph of the Dominican theologian and mathematician, Bishop Gerard de Laurier. He was consecrated by Bishop Thuc to the episcopacy on May 7th, 1981. And this took place in Bishop Thuc's residence in Toulon, France. Bishop de Laurier died in February of 1988. He consecrated His Excellency Bishop McKenna on August 22nd, 1986, and I believe one or two other bishops. Then there was another Episcopal consecration in 1981, and that was Father Adolfo Zamora and Father Moises Carmona. They were both Mexicans. And that was on October 17th, 1981. Likewise, this consecration took place in the residence of Bishop Thuc in Toulon, France. And Bishop Zamora died in 1987, and Bishop Carmona, very tragically, in a car accident on All Saints' Day in 1991. Then let me give you a few facts on the Society of St. Pius V. I am using the term loosely here for my presentation because there is also a congregation of St. Pius V, which was founded in 1996 by Bishop Clarence Kelly, and they're technically two separate orders, two separate societies, but for purposes of this presentation, we can just consider them one and the same. The Society of St. Pius V was established in 1983, and that was really with the dismissal of the Nine from the Society of St. Pius X. The Society of St. Pius V has distinguished itself as being really the fiercest opponents of the 1981 Thuc consecrations and any subsequent consecrations and ordinations in the Thuc lineage. The Society of St. Pius V and Congregation of St. Pius V consists of the following clergy. We have Bishop Clarence Kelly, Bishop Joseph Sante, Father William Jenkins, Father Martin Skirky, Father Paul Skirky, Father Paul Baumberger, Father James Curatolo, Father James Carroll, Father Matthew Newman, Father Joseph Greenwell, Father Thomas Mrochka, and Father Benjamin Selway. And I hope I didn't forget anybody. Their headquarters are in Round Top, New York. That's in the Catskill area. As regards the person of Bishop Clarence Kelly, he was born in 1941 and ordained a priest by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre for the Society of St. Pius X on April 14, 1973, at Icone, Switzerland. He co-founded the Society of St. Pius V in 1983, and he founded the Daughters of Mary in 1984. Bishop Kelly was himself consecrated a bishop by Bishop Alfred Mendez on October 19, 1993 in Carlsbad, California. This consecration was kept secret until the death of Bishop Mendez in 1995. And lastly, Bishop Kelly founded, as I already said, this Congregation of St. Pius V in 1996. And all the ordinations that he has done were for clergy in the Congregation of St. Pius V in 1996. So really, the Society of St. Pius V will cease to exist once the last cleric there is deceased, and it will only be the Congregation of St. Pius V. At this point, I would like to ask you to please pray for Bishop Kelly, because he is very ill. I saw a recent picture of him, and he looked very gaunt. And if you could just, in your charity, pray for him. We certainly don't wish him any ill, and I think he would benefit greatly from our prayers. I next want to talk about Bishop Kelly's book, The Sacred and the Profane, which was written by Bishop Kelly. It was published in 1997, and it was considered the Society of St. Pius V's definitive answer to the Thuc bishops, outlining their case against the consecrations and related issues, and it was also a defense of Bishop Kelly's own consecration by Bishop Mendez in 1993, and there's a lot of documentation on that. The title kind of gives it away. Guess who's the sacred? Guess who's the profane? Okay. Or which orders are considered sacred, which orders are considered profane. You don't have to get a hard copy of the book. You can actually get it for free online from the Society of St. Pius V, from their own website. And it is available as a PDF file, and you can even search for keywords, so that makes it very convenient in case you should decide to get that book, which I don't recommend, unless you just want to. I mean, it's fair game. Get both sides by all means. And so much for the sacred and the profane.
Next, let's take a quick snapshot at Bishop Joseph Sante. He was born in 1969. He was ordained a priest by Bishop Kelly on May 4th, 2001, and consecrated a bishop on February 28th, 2007 in Oyster Bay Cove, New York. He resides at Immaculate Heart Seminary in Round Top, and he can be considered, I guess, the successor to Bishop Kelly. Now, so much for the main clergy involved here. We now need to look at the questions that we want to investigate. We'll break it down into 3 sections. We first have to consider the question of fact. Does the Catholic Church require us to hold that the 1981 Thuc consecrations took place? That's the first thing we'll have to investigate, because if we don't know that they took place, all the rest is irrelevant. Once we have established that indeed they took place, we will have to consider the question of validity. Does the Church require us to accept the 1981 consecrations as valid? And finally, once we have established that not only did they occur and were valid, we will consider their lawfulness. Were the 1981 Thuc consecrations in accordance with church law? So let's begin with part 1 regarding fact. Does the Church require us to hold that the Thuc consecrations in 1981 took place? I'm going to offer you a syllogism. There'll be 2 premises and a conclusion. Now, I'm afraid that is probably, I don't know how easy that is to read for you. I'm going to, by the way, try to post this PowerPoint presentation on the website once I get back home to my computer. So I would like to make that available to anyone who's interested. Premise 1. Canon law says that facts must be proved unless they are so-called notorious facts. And that's according to Canon 1747, number 1, which means that unless they are facts that are publicly known and committed in such manner that they cannot be concealed or excused. So what we're saying is that obviously if you're out there saying such and such has happened, of course you need to prove it. But when you don't have to prove it is when the fact is notorious, when it is so clear and so obvious that it took place, that it happened, that there's really no denying it. And the reason is quite simply that the Church's law is not trying to be overly unreasonable, overly burdensome. The Church's law is not useless. And it would be useless to try to prove something what everyone else already knows is true. Okay? So this is going to be our first premise. Facts have to be proved unless they are notorious. The second premise, the 1981 consecrations of Bishops de Laurier, Carmona, and Zamora are notorious facts. So it will be easy to see what the conclusion is. Therefore, according to the Church's law, no additional legal or formal proof is required because all the legal formalities aim to produce is certainty regarding the facts. But notorious facts are already certain. Okay, so this is going to be the basic argument. What I'm going to have to do now is prove premise number 2. Premise number 1 is already proven because it's taken straight from the Church's law. The church law says notorious facts require no additional evidence. Of course, you have to first prove that it is a notorious fact. But once that is established, there's nothing else you have to prove. And I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute. So premise 2, the 1981 consecrations of Bishops de Laurier, Carmona, and Zamora are notorious facts. How do we know that? Well, let's look at what evidence do we have for the consecrations. First of all, we have photos. Okay, we have photos of the ceremonies that were published in a Sedevacantist magazine in Germany. And in fact, some of them are reproduced in my study, which you can download for free online, or you can just get this beautiful paperback copy that the good sisters of the CMRI printed and bound. And see, they came out really beautiful. Okay, so yes, right there you can see the consecrations took place. All right, but we have more than just these photos. We have sworn testimony by Dr. Kurt Hiller and Dr. Eberhard Heller of Munich, Germany, who assisted at the consecration ceremonies. They both swore an oath and said, yes, the consecrations took place, we were there. Then we have sworn testimony by Father Noel Barbara in France. He swore an oath that Bishop Godin Thuc acknowledged to him in person to have performed the consecrations. Okay? Father Barbara went to visit Bishop Thuc, and they spoke about these things, and Father Barbara has sworn that Bishop Thuc acknowledged this to him. Then, of course, we have the testimony by the consecrator, Bishop Thuc himself, as well as the ordinands, de Laurier, Cremona, and Zamora. They all said, yes, this happened. Bishop Thuc consecrated us bishops, and Bishop Thuc said, yes, I consecrated these men. Then we have a consecration certificate for Bishop Cremona, issued by Bishop Thuc. And that is also reproduced photographically in my study, and it's also available on the internet. And this certificate turned up after the death of Bishop Cremona in 1991. It was found among his personal files. I would imagine very much so that the Bishop Thuc also wrote a certificate for Bishop Zamora and Bishop de Laurier, but at least as far as I know, we don't have these. We don't have these copies. Doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means we don't have them. Next, there's even more evidence. The Novus Ordo Vatican's official excommunication against Bishop Thuc for the consecrations, published around the world after a quote-unquote well-founded inquiry confirming that the consecrations occurred. Well-founded inquiry, that's straight from a letter of Cardinal Ratzinger. Okay? They excommunicated Bishop Thuc. For what? For something that we don't even know happened? No, absurd. They looked into the matter, they found out he consecrated these men, and said, okay, guess what? Here's your excommunication. And finally, and this is my personal favorite, Bishop Kelly himself acknowledges that the consecrations were performed. If he didn't, he wouldn't have anything to talk about. Right? So, all of this proves our premise number 2. The consecrations are notorious facts. Does anybody else have any question about these consecrations having occurred? I don't see any hands being raised, okay? I mean, it's crystal clear. Bishop Thuc consecrated these men, like it or not. And so the conclusion here is that we have certitude that the consecrations took place. Okay, therefore, these consecrations can be considered notorious facts, and canon law says notorious facts don't need any additional evidence. Okay, this is enough. We don't need any additional signatures, notarized documents, whatnot. This is enough. Okay, so we are certain that the consecrations occurred. Now, there are 3 kinds of certitude. We can be certain about things in different ways. The kind of certitude we have, and this gets a little bit philosophical, but it's really just common sense. It's called moral certitude. Let me explain to you quickly what moral certitude is. It's not difficult. Moral certitude, first of all, is distinguished from metaphysical and physical certitude. Don't be afraid. I know this is technical terminology, but it is all, like I just said, just common sense. What is metaphysical certitude? Metaphysical certitude is the kind of certitude we have that a triangle has 3 sides, 1 plus 1 equals 2. Okay? It's infallible. There's no way this could be wrong. You will never find a triangle that doesn't have 3 sides. Right? It is true by definition. It could not be otherwise. In fact, not even God could change it. Right? And that's simply because it's true by definition. As long as you understand what a triangle is, you know it's going to have 3 sides. It's kind of like the certitude that every bachelor is unmarried. Okay? I mean, there's just no such thing as a married bachelor because that's just not what a bachelor is. All right? So this is metaphysical. This is the highest kind of certitude. Okay? Infallible, couldn't be otherwise, impossible, not even God could change it. Now, there's another kind of certitude, and that is physical certitude. And that's based on the laws of nature. Water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? As I guess Sister Meshtild would say, that's just how it is. All right? God rest her soul. Now, this is based on and known from the laws of nature. In theory, it could be otherwise, if God so decreed. Okay? For example, in miracles. I mean, it is certainly conceivable that water should boil at some other temperature, right? Why not? But this is how God created it. He made water in such a way that it would boil at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. All right? And God overrides these laws when He works miracles. All right, so we have metaphysical certitude, we have physical certitude. But there's one more that we're lacking, and that is our moral certitude. What then is moral certitude? It's not metaphysical certitude, and it's not physical certitude. Moral certitude is defined as the kind of reasonable certitude that makes error impossible or very unlikely according to what is customary among mankind. For example, we are certain that George Washington existed. We don't have metaphysical certitude regarding that, and it definitely has nothing to do with the laws of nature. We don't have physical certitude about it either. But we're still kind of certain, aren't we? Well, that would be moral certitude, right? We have historical testimony, aplenty, and it would be, in theory, it would be possible that this is a gigantic conspiracy, to make us all believe George Washington existed and he never did. But according to what is customary among mankind, error here would be extremely unlikely. All right? Another great example is people will run from a burning house. Right? We all agree with that? Right? We are certain about that, not with metaphysical certitude, not with physical certitude, but with moral certitude. I mean, in theory, yes, you could have somebody that absolutely refuses to, but not according to what is customary among mankind. Now, so this moral certitude is what we have regarding the 2 consecrations. It suffices to know that the consecrations occurred. We don't need physical certitude. We couldn't have that anyway. And we certainly don't need metaphysical certitude regarding the 2 consecrations either. We just need moral certitude. It is indeed the highest kind of certitude that can possibly be had in this matter. There's no higher. We can't have physical certitude regarding the consecrations, and we can't have metaphysical certitude. And the beauty here is that even though the church has, these legal formalities that you normally have to go through in order to prove an ordination, I mean, really the normal way to ascertain that somebody was ordained would be to contact the diocese, and they look it up in their offices. They have a registry, and they pull out, the entry and see was he ordained or not. Well, okay, great. Granted, we don't have that for the Thuc consecrations, and we don't have it for any traditional Catholic consecrations or ordinations either. But that's not all that important, because this moral certitude, we can still have moral certitude, because it is not bound up with these legal bells and whistles per se. In other words, the legal formalities are only there as the ordinary way to bring about this moral certitude. Okay? But they're not absolutely needed to know that the consecrations occurred. I mean, we just went through the whole list of how we know they occurred. And consider that even a legal church judgment could not produce a higher kind of certitude. Even if you had, please God, a pope who would come out and say, yes, I certify, I confirm, I verify, Thuc consecrations occurred, they're valid, they're lawful. That wouldn't increase the kind of certitude. It would still be moral certitude. It might perhaps be a higher degree, but it would still only be moral certitude. Okay, I don't mean to beat this to death now either. I think we've covered that sufficiently. It really just stands to reason that the reason the church has all these formal legal regulations regarding that is that this is simply the ordinary way to produce this moral certitude for the people that somebody has been ordained. Now, let us, to make the same point in another way, let us, for the moment, try to argue the opposite. Let's try to argue that the consecrations did not occur. How would you do that? I mean, considering all the evidence we just went through, would simply be absurd. Imagine yourself in front of an ecclesiastical judge trying to argue the consecrations didn't occur. And the judge shows you the photos and the certificate and the testimony and the sworn statements, and he says to you, what are you talking about? We would have to presuppose a gigantic conspiracy theory without any foundation. It would be extremely imprudent to believe that despite all this evidence that the consecrations did not occur, that somehow it was just a gigantic setup, that the witnesses were bribed and the photos were doctored, and yes, in theory it's possible, okay? Just like it's possible George Washington never existed, right? But it would be extremely silly to believe this, absent any evidence, and you could never prove it in an ecclesiastical court, could you? Now, the next point I want to make is consider that the church and society convict people based on moral certitude of their guilt and acquit people based on a lack of that moral certitude. Okay? It's good enough for the church, it's good enough for society, it's got to be good enough for Bishop Kelly, I'm sorry. Now, Canon 1869, paragraph 1 in the Church's canon law, says that an ecclesiastical judge must make his decisions based on, want to guess? Moral certitude, Canon 1869, okay? It literally says he is required to achieve moral certitude regarding the point to be decided, okay? Not infallible metaphysical certitude, not physical certitude, just moral certitude. Pope Pius XII said in an address to the Roman Rota, which is quoted at length in my study. Pope Pius XII said, this is October 1st, 1942, he says, "And ecclesiastical judges may not deny on legal grounds what they personally know to be true through moral certitude." In other words, if you know that this is a fact, don't deny it just because of some legal mumbo-jumbo. Okay? Don't use the church's law to throw obstacles in the way of something that we know to be true. Okay? It's very reasonable. It's really just common sense. And yeah, actually that was my next point. There is no conflict between church law and common sense. Right? In other words, the church's law is reasonable. Now, something else I want to mention is that there is ample evidence in the church's historical practice that proves that moral certitude is sufficient to accept sacraments as having taken place. There's a very good book out there. It was written by Father Eugene Sullivan. It's published by the Catholic University of America Press in 1944. And the book is called Proof of the Reception of the Sacraments. It's a very interesting book. And it was one of the first things I read when I did my research, because Bishop Kelly quotes that book, makes reference to it in his book, The Sacred and the Profane. And so I said, okay, this is a book I'm going to have to read cover to cover. I need to get the full picture. And after having finished the book, it was clear that Father Eugene Sullivan does not agree with Bishop Kelly's position. Not even close. Okay? Father Sullivan, unfortunately I don't have a copy here. Father Sullivan's book is virtually screaming moral certitude on every page. Okay? Bishop Kelly just picked out a sentence or a paragraph or something and tried to use it to back up one of his points. But if you read the book cover to cover, and I doubt Bishop Kelly did that, then you find out, okay, this book is definitely not supporting Bishop Kelly or the Society of St. Pius V's position. All right. So anyway, enough of moral certitude. We have proved premise number 2. If you remember, the premise number 2 was the 1981 consecrations. Thuc consecrations are notorious facts, right? We said notorious facts don't need any additional evidence. The Thuc consecrations are notorious facts, therefore we don't need any additional evidence, we don't need any more signed documents, any additional witnesses. We're good. We have all that we need to know that they occurred. Now, the second part we want to talk about is validity. Now that we've seen that the Church requires us to believe that the two consecrations occurred, we need to ask, does the Church also require us to accept them as valid? Again, I'm going to give you 2 premises and a conclusion. That's the way to do this, right? The first premise, and we will prove this in a minute. Once we know that a sacramental ceremony has taken place, the Church requires us to presume validity until the contrary is proved. Proved, mind you, not just asserted. The second premise is we know the sacramental ceremonies in question, the 1981 Thuc consecrations, have taken place. Guess what the conclusion is? According to Church teaching, we are required to believe that the 1981 consecrations were valid until someone can prove they were not. So, let me go ahead and prove premise 1. Once we know that the ceremony has taken place, the Church requires us to presume validity. First, I need to mention that, properly speaking, no sacrament can ever be proved valid. It can only be presumed valid. Sometimes we might perhaps speak about proving a sacrament valid, but really what we mean is that we've only proven that we must presume it to be valid. Why is it that a sacrament can never be proved valid? It's because there's no empirical evidence possible to verify validity, right? There's nothing we can point to, say, for example, to a baptism and say, oh, here, look at this. Now I can prove it valid, okay? I mean, there's no halo that appears or anything empirical. You can't do that. So we cannot prove validity. Or likewise, of course, with any other sacrament, for example, with the Holy Eucharist, yes, after the consecration, the bread and wine cease to exist with only the appearances remaining, and the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord are there, substantially present. But empirically, you don't see the difference, okay, unless God works a miracle, a Eucharistic miracle. Again, no sacrament can ever be proved valid because, in theory, the minister or even the recipient could secretly withhold the intention, and we would never know it. Which means we must trust in divine providence. And that is really the Church's position. Okay? So all we can do is outline that in a particular case, all the conditions have been met that allow and require us to presume that the sacrament is valid. And if you have any questions about that, there'll be some questions and answers at the end. So the question then is, at what point do we have sufficient grounds for presuming a sacrament valid? The Church says, when the fact of the ceremony has been proved, right, when we know that the ceremony occurred, then we have to presume that the sacrament was valid. And this is amply proven, like I just mentioned in Father Sullivan's book, Proof of the Reception of the Sacraments. Father Sullivan goes through really the history of the Church and talks about all sorts of different examples of how people proved that they had received the sacrament. There was a time in the Church's history when people had to prove to their pastor that they made their Easter duty. Okay, and the pastor would keep a book, and enter that, yes, Mr. So-and-so, Mrs. So-and-so, made their Easter duty. And if you were away during the Easter season on travel, you had to prove to the pastor that you made your Easter duty somewhere else. Okay? This is for also, there's, in my study, on page 16, I quote Father Doheny, basically to the same effect that once we know the ceremony occurred, validity is simply presumed. Now, the obligation of ensuring that the ceremony was valid is, according to canon law, canon 1002, is on the minister. Okay? Whoever administers the sacrament is the one who must ensure it is valid. It's not you or me, it's not the recipient, okay? That would be on the minister, according to canon law. It's also really evident from daily liturgical life. Yeah, think about it. No one ever hears, almost no one hears the priest pronounce the words of consecration, right? At your last Mass, did you hear Father pronounce the words of consecration? I didn't. Likewise, no one verifies that the host and the wine have the proper ingredients. Now, do they? Okay, no. Father goes, he vests, he goes up to the altar and says Mass, and we presume all that, right? We assume that the Father's going to do it right. He's going to use the right, the valid matter, and he's going to pronounce the words of consecration, and we have moral certitude that it is so. Consider also that most people don't know the formula of absolution in the confessional, right? For goodness sakes, you're saying your act of contrition, Would you like a special validity witness with you in the confessional? Didn't think so. Right? Consider also you would never have any certainty of having received the sacrament of extreme unction. Sorry, I wasn't conscious. Sorry, I was sick. I really didn't hear Father say the right words, or I don't know if he used the right oils. It's getting really absurd, okay? The alternative, if this weren't true, would simply be that we would need special validity witnesses for all sorts of sacraments all the time, including confession. So we can see the Church in her daily liturgical life, if the ceremony occurs, the rest is presumed. Now, if we wanted to prove the contrary, if we wanted to prove that the 1981 consecrations of Bishop Thuc were invalid, we would have to demonstrate the following things. Now notice the key word is demonstrate. Not insinuate, not suggest, not wonder out loud, but demonstrate that Bishop Thuc did not use the correct matter, the laying on of hands, or the correct form, which would be the 16-word prayer at the end of the preface when consecrating, or someone would have to demonstrate that Bishop Thuc did not have the intention to do what the church does. In other words, did not intend to consecrate bishops because of either ill will or distraction or insanity. Okay? And this goes back to what Father Casimir was saying yesterday, right, about what's necessary to make a sacrament valid. So here we have the matter of the intention. So the bishop must, of course, have the intention to do what the church does, but this intention is presumed absent any evidence to the contrary. So if I wanted to demonstrate that Bishop Thuc did not consecrate bishops, I'd have to demonstrate, again, either that he didn't impose hands, or he didn't say the right prayer, or he didn't have the intention to do what the church does. And as far as that intention business, it would have to be externally manifested. So it would have to be something like Bishop Thuc would have to say before or during the ceremony, "Oh, we're just going through the motions. We're just playing around. You know, I don't intend to make a bishop," for example, or some other. There would have to be some other external manifestation that he did not intend to do what the church does. And it would certainly be very hard to prove this because people are understood to intend to do what they do. In addition to that, it would also be very hard to do. How would you go through a ceremony of episcopal consecration without intending to? That would be very difficult. It's not impossible, but I think, it's my opinion at least, I think that this withholding your attention business would be very difficult to do. I mean, try to eat a meal without intending to be eating. It's very difficult. Okay? Now, as far as distractions during the ceremony go, you can be distracted during the ceremony. Okay? If you're Bishop Thuc and yes, you're going through the ceremony of episcopal consecration, even your distractions, even voluntary distractions, do not nullify the intention to do as the church does unless they are so great that they become incompatible with the sacramental action. And I try to kind of simplify this. The actual technical terminology behind it is really frightening, but basically, you would have to distract yourself so much that you couldn't reasonably be said to be intending to do what you're doing. So one theologian gave an example of you have to be pondering complex mathematical theorems as you're, imposing hands and praying this essential 16 words. Okay, I never met Bishop Thuc, but I'm pretty sure he wasn't pondering complex mathematical theorems at the 1981 consecrations. As far as the mental state goes, mental state, that is important because you must be acting as a rational agent in order to have the intention to do what the church does. Your mental state would have to be so severely compromised that you could not form that intention. And I submit that it is impossible to go through a ceremony of episcopal consecration, which is a very long ceremony, and not realize you're consecrating bishops. Okay? And I think that's very reasonable. Now, the church says that as far as this intention business goes, the intention is hardly ever lacking in practice. Okay? And this goes back to divine providence. This is how God created the church and created the sacraments, and he will see to it that by and large, the sacraments will be valid. And you can find in my study all the quotes and the backup and all of this. I just, couldn't put all of that on a PowerPoint slide. So again, one would have to prove that Bishop Thuc either did or probably did any of these things here if you wanted to raise sufficient doubt regarding the validity of the consecrations, okay? Now this proves premise one. As a quick refresher here, premise one was once we know that the ceremony has taken place, the church requires us to presume validity. What we've just gone through proves this, so we must accept the consecrations as valid. And it's really all just very much common sense, really. The next part we have to consider is part 3, lawfulness. Now that we've seen the consecrations occurred, now that we've seen that the church requires us to presume them as valid, we still have to ask, okay, but were they in accordance with the law of the church? And before we can answer that question, there's a few preliminary considerations I'd like to share with you. The church's law is called canon law. And a canon law is essentially rules, commands, and prohibitions for the conduct of the members of the church. Canon law is proposed and enacted by the rightful ecclesiastical superiors. Okay, especially the Pope. Right? The Code of Canon Law was promulgated in 1917 by the authority of Pope Benedict XV. Now, canon law will have two kinds of laws in it. Okay, some laws are divine in origin. They're divine laws. For example, there's a divine law that we must receive Holy Communion, and that is necessary for salvation by necessity of precept. Okay, that is a divine law. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you shall not have life within you. And now, as I said, it's I don't want to confuse anybody, but it's necessary by necessity of precept. So that means it's not absolutely necessary, but it ought to be done because God has commanded it. So for those, obviously there are many cases where it's impossible, maybe babies who die just after birth, you can only baptize them, obviously they would still go to heaven. So these laws in the Code of Canon Law that are divine in origin are, of course, unchangeable, and the church cannot dispense from them, and that's because the church didn't make the laws. Okay, God did. So the church certainly has no authority to dispense from laws that were instituted by God. But there are other laws in the Code of Canon Law that are ecclesiastical or human in origin, and those are properly the church laws. And of course, these laws are changeable, and the church can dispense from them. The church can even do away with them entirely, at least in theory. Okay? And it's important to go through this first so that we understand what follows regarding excommunication and all these things. So we need to look at those preliminary considerations first. So what is the purpose of canon law? Why does the church have laws? Well, there's a twofold purpose. One is I believe it's called the proximate purpose, and that is to promote and ensure the common good of the church community at large. Okay, I think that's all very much common sense, right? The church has laws in order to regulate the conduct of her members. Okay, and the point is to ensure the common good of everybody in the church. Now, the ultimate end, though, the ultimate purpose of canon law is to facilitate and safeguard the salvation of souls. Obviously, that's what the church is about. And that is what the church was commissioned to do. And so all of her laws, everything she does is directed to that ultimate end. Facilitate and safeguard the salvation of souls. The church is there for souls. So now that we've looked at these preliminary considerations, we want to take a look at church law and penalties. Okay, because penalties are, in fact, a part of church law. And they are imposed by the church's authority. They can be changed or rescinded if they are ecclesiastical in nature and origin. Okay, like we were just saying, some laws are ecclesiastical in origin, and they can be changed, they can be dispensed from, they can be done away with. Same with penalties, because penalties are a part of the church's law. By the way, am I going too fast, or am I fairly good? Okay. Now, the penalties of church penalties, of course, likewise have a purpose. They exist not to make life difficult for us, but rather to deter crime, punish offenses, and help reform the offender, once again for the ultimate purpose of facilitating the salvation of souls. Right? Again, all this is very reasonable, very common sense, very, very basic, I think. Now, there are three kinds of penalties in the church. The first one is called a remedial penalty, and it is not a penalty in the strict sense, and so it's actually irrelevant to the Thuc consecrations, and we're not going to get into that. Then the next two kinds of penalties are going to be very important to distinguish. Medicinal penalty. A penalty can be a medicinal penalty. It is also known as a censure. Okay? And the main purpose of a medicinal penalty is to act as medicine for the delinquent. Right? It is supposed to help him reform. It's the church saying, hey, you did something wrong. We want you to repent of this. We want you to make reparation for this, and we want you to come out of that state that you're in and, repent of what you've done. That is a medicinal penalty. And this is important. An example of a medicinal penalty would be an excommunication and a suspension. So when the church hurls a sentence of excommunication against someone, the point is to tell that person, you did something gravely wrong, and you're being punished now with this excommunication because we want you to come to your senses. Okay, you've done something wrong, it's not right. You need to get your act together, and until you do, you are excommunicated. And we'll get into what an excommunication is a little later. So that is what a medicinal penalty is. But that's not the only kind of penalty. You can also have a vindictive penalty. The main purpose of a vindictive penalty, unlike the medicinal penalty, is the expiation of the crime committed. It exists to chastise the offender and to redress the wrong done. Okay? And an example of this would be the privation of clerical garb. Okay? I can't think of any offenses against church law that would receive a vindictive penalty, but we'll just take a hypothetical case of a priest who has committed such an offense, and the church imposes a vindictive penalty on him. The church says, for example, you can not wear your clerical garb for the next, 2 months, okay? And that is our punishment. It's, yes, of course, we want you to come to your senses, but regardless of whether you've already repented, you still have to, you still cannot be wearing clerical garb in order to expiate the crime, to chastise you, and to redress the wrong done. Okay? So we need to keep in mind there's medicinal penalties and vindictive penalties, and the medicinal exist to help somebody to help somebody repent of the grave evil done. The vindictive penalty, the main purpose there is to redress the wrong done and to expiate the crime. Now, when and how does the church impose penalties? There are two ways the church imposes penalties. One is after the commission of the offense through the intervention of the ecclesiastical superior or judge. This kind of penalty is called ferende sententiae. Okay, and what that means is basically that the sentence, the penalty, must be imposed by the judge or by the superior. Okay, unless and until the judge or the superior imposes that penalty, it isn't incurred. Okay, and this is really what we have in secular society. You know, you have to show up in court if you did something wrong, and then until the judge gives you the sentence, you have not incurred a penalty. But then the church can impose a sentence in a different way, because the church has authority, has jurisdiction over the internal forum. Unlike society, in society you're just not going to incur a penalty until the judge sentences you, but the church has jurisdiction over your soul, and so the church can impose a sentence automatically and immediately when the offense is committed. Okay? This would be without the intervention of a judge or superior. This kind of penalty is called a late sententiae penalty, as opposed to ferende sententiae, and so it is not an imposed sentence, but an automatic sentence. It is imposed automatically, simply by committing the crime. It is more serious than a ferende sententiae penalty, the one we discussed first, because it is incurred immediately. Okay, so that would indicate that it is more serious. There is no church trial or judgment necessary. The penalty is incurred as soon as the crime is committed. Now, for a penalty to be automatic, one of those late sententiae penalties, the church's law must specifically indicate this. Okay? Otherwise, the penalty is considered ferende sententiae. Okay? So we just said that the late sententiae is more serious. So it kind of stands to reason that unless the law of the church clearly indicates that this crime results in a late sententiae penalty, unless that is clearly stated, it will only be ferende sententiae. Okay? Most penalties, in fact, are ferende sententiae. Most penalties have to be imposed by an ecclesiastical superior or judge. All right, next point, we have to assess guilt. Ferende sententiae penalties, the ones where you have to have the intervention of the superior, these are only inflicted if the putative offender is personally guilty. Okay? This might seem kind of obvious, but it's important to note that the church will only inflict a penalty if the person, the putative offender, is actually morally culpable. Okay? And whether or not or to what extent somebody is morally culpable is determined at an ecclesiastical trial. Right? Because really, without guilt, there can be no punishment. I mean, that only makes sense. So, you know, for example, I'm trying to think of something where, you know, you might accidentally break the law of the church and not realize it, okay? If you were a cleric and, you know, in normal times you would then be, you know, someone before a judge, an ecclesiastical judge. If it turns out you can prove that, sorry, I really didn't realize this, either I didn't know I was breaking the law, or yes, I know I did this, but I didn't realize that this is punished, you know, with a penalty. So these are the kinds of things that would be determined at an ecclesiastical trial. Mitigating factors, as far as assessing guilt goes, include ignorance, fear, lack of the use of reason, and intoxication. And of course, it is the judge or the superior who has the authority to determine the degree of guilt in the putative offender. All right, well, that's for ferende sententia penalties. For late sententia penalties, the kind that are imposed automatically or incurred automatically and immediately upon committing the offense, the church assesses guilt as follows. Remember, there is no trial, right? There is no judge. So how do you assess guilt? Well, the church says that the full guilt is presumed until the contrary is proved in an ecclesiastical court. So at first you're going to be presumed guilty, and then, you can have your case taken in front of an ecclesiastical court, and then if you can prove, and really the burden of proof is on you then, on the delinquent, if you can prove and demonstrate that you were not culpable, or at least not fully culpable, then that is something that will be decided at a ecclesiastical trial. Okay, so you would have to prove that you did not know you were violating the law, or that you violated the law while you were, for example, on medicine that impaired the use of your reason. Okay, violating the law. There's the letter of the law, the spirit of the law, right? Sometimes occasions may arise in which observing the letter of the law would violate its spirit. Okay? In other words, where keeping the law would not serve the purpose of the law, okay, which we saw was ultimately the salvation of souls. Okay? And how is this possible? Well, it's simply possible because the lawgiver, right, the Pope, the Church, can only make laws that apply in general. I mean, no Pope can possibly envision and make law for every possible circumstance, for every possible case. Right? That's only reasonable. So, and that's really the case for everything, civil law as well. You can only make laws generally. So, what happens if an occasion arises, a scenario arises where really, keeping the letter of the law would be totally contrary to its spirit? And the church, again, is very reasonable and very merciful. And we can invoke here a principle, what the church calls the principle of epikeia, which basically means equity or fairness. What is it? Epikeia is the interpretation of the mind and the will of the legislator, okay, the lawgiver, right, the Pope, basically. And epikeia looks at, okay, what did the legislator intend in making a particular law? What was the point in making this law? Remember, we saw that the church doesn't just make laws. The church makes laws for a particular reason, to order the conduct of her members, for the common good, and ultimately to help save as many souls as possible. That's the point of why there is a law. So we need to remember what the legislator intended in making a particular law, and we need to remember that, of course, the spirit of the law, in other words, the purpose of the law, is superior to the letter of the law. That is what epikeia is, basically. I'm simplifying it. Now, epikeia can be impermissible in a certain case. It can be permissible. And it can even be obligatory in a particular case. All right? For example, take the case of, we'll use a very simple example. Mother is alone with her children at home, and they're all small children, well, let's say 10 and younger. And she says, I'm going to have to go run to the store. I'll be back in 15 minutes. Children, don't leave the house. So she goes to the store, and a fire breaks out in the house. What are the children supposed to do? No, Mommy said we can't leave the house. Well, of course, the mother wasn't foreseeing that circumstance, right? Mother doesn't want her children to stay in the house and burn to death. Okay? Of course, the mother would want the letter of her law to be, in this case, disobeyed, and she wants her children to be safe, and obviously the children would have to leave the house. Okay? The mother would want the children to disobey because that's not the point of her law of not leaving the house. That's not why she told them that. It's not so that they would be hurt, but so that they would be safe. All right? Very much common sense. So, again, this law of the children can't leave the house was meant to apply in general. It was not meant to apply when there's an unforeseen circumstance justifying the children leaving the house. Okay, and this is what we mean by epikeia. Common sense, look at what the law was intended to do, and if there's a conflict between the purpose of the law and the letter of the law, by all means, the spirit of the law is superior to the letter. And we can see this in the gospel, for example. Our Lord rebuked the Pharisees for clinging to the letter of the law against and to the detriment of its spirit. And you know, this was in the context of keeping versus violating the Sabbath in chapter 2 of St. Mark's Gospel. And our Lord said, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. And likewise, the law of the church was made for souls. Souls were not made for the law. So, just to stay with that example of the Sabbath rest, we must violate the Sunday rest sometimes to help a neighbor in grave need, okay? We can't say, oh, sorry, no, it's Sunday, I can't do servile work, sorry, you're going to have to suffer, can't help you there. That would be sinful, and that is not what the Sunday rest is for, okay? That would be totally contrary to the gospel. So that's a great example of where we must act contrary to the letter of the law in order to uphold its spirit, to uphold the purpose for why the law exists in the first place. Now we've covered a lot here. It's time we took this epikeia business that I just talked about, and let's apply it to the Thuc consecrations. Let's see what we get here. I think we can all agree that in 1981, there was an urgent need in the world to have sedevacantis bishops. Can we all agree on that? Believe it or not, I've had a friend of mine in Cincinnati dispute that one. If somebody wants to dispute that, we'll take it outside. No. We'll have a separate discussion on that. I'm sorry, but it's simply absurd to suggest that in 1981 there was no need for sedevacantis bishops. Okay? It's simply, I think it's silly, it's absurd. But we can talk about that. Why was there an urgent need? Well, for one thing, to perpetuate the sacraments, and to perpetuate the apostolic succession, at least materially. All right, that's why we had a need then, and still do now, but it's certainly not as grave and urgent as it was 30 years ago. Now, here comes the first problem. The Bishop Thuc, of course, did not have the necessary authorization from the Holy See to consecrate bishops because Holy See was vacant. All right, and according to Canon 953, you need a papal mandate before you can consecrate a bishop. Okay, you need the authorization from the Pope before you can go ahead and consecrate a bishop. Then we have a second problem, and that is Bishop Thuc might have been, and I say might because I'm certainly not competent to resolve the controversy, and thankfully I don't need to. But let's just say he might have been under excommunication or suspension for having previously consecrated objectively unworthy men to the episcopacy. Okay, for example, clergy in the Palmer de Troyes group, Jean Laborie, and others. And we don't need to go into, who did he consecrate and did he really, and all of a sudden you have a whole list of names and a whole list of claims that, everybody says, oh yeah, I was consecrated by Bishop Thuc, and, I was too, and in any case, let's just say, yes, he consecrated the wrong men. He did, okay? At least some. And let us just assume, because we want to be on the safe side here, okay? I didn't want to argue anything that I would have to later maybe say, oh gee, maybe I was wrong about him not being excommunicated, and now my whole argument, falls down like a house of cards. I said, I'm going to assume, at least for the sake of argument, that he was excommunicated, because that's the worst thing that could have happened, right? If it was still okay, if it's still lawful for Bishop Thuc to consecrate Bishops Carmona, Zamora, and Delorier, even if he was under excommunication, then all the better. So let's just say that Bishop Thuc might have been under excommunication or suspension for having consecrated the wrong people, and therefore, of course, without the presumed papal permission. Obviously, no pope would give permission to consecrate somebody who's not worthy to be consecrated. Okay, so we couldn't even presume a papal permission, and this goes back to Canons 2370 and the decree from the Holy Office of April 9th, 1951. And this is all explained at great length in my study. Okay, so these are two problems, okay, that we're looking at. Maybe Bishop Thuc was excommunicated, and in any case he didn't have papal authorization, as is required by the Church's law, to consecrate these three bishops in 1981. However, the salvation and good of souls demanded the consecration of sedevacantis bishops, didn't it? So, how are we going to resolve this conundrum now? The fact of the matter is that Bishop Thuc, at the time in 1981, was the only bishop, at least as far as I know, the only bishop professing the Roman Catholic faith and willing to consecrate sedevacantis bishops. Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre was not willing to consecrate sedevacantists. Bishop de Castro-Meyer was not willing to consecrate sedevacantists. Bishop Blaise Kurtz, who was a German missionary bishop in China, was already deceased as of 1973. He might have been willing to do it, but he was already dead. And Bishop Alfred Mendez, and that's the bishop the Society of St. Pius V used to consecrate Bishop Kelly. I'm sorry, but he also was not willing to consecrate sedevacantists in 1981. In fact, just 3 years earlier, he was still involved with the Novus Ordo, serving as a co-consecrator in 1978, making modernist bishops. Okay? Now, I'm not trying to bash Bishop Mendez, but it is a fact. Okay, that is the public record, and it's got to be fair game, right? If the public record is fair game for Bishop Thuc, it has to be fair game for Bishop Mendez. And I know that that was the case, that he co-consecrated two modernists for the Novus Ordo Church in Oregon in 1978, because I have a photocopy of the diocesan newspaper article. And I even spoke by email with one of the bishops, Bishop Mendez, co-consecrated. And he explained to me why Bishop Mendez had been chosen, because I think one of the other consecrants was also a Holy Cross father, like Bishop Mendez. And the bishop, the Novus Ordo bishop that I contacted was Bishop, I think his name is Kenneth Steiner. He was one of the two ordinance, and the other one was Paul Waldschmidt, who's already deceased. So there's no question, yes, Bishop Mendez did in fact still participate in the Novus Ordo, making bishops for the Novus Ordo Church as late as 1978, so you can understand that in 1981 he wasn't around either to consecrate Sedevacantis. And I'm not trying to find fault with him. We've all had our journey out of the Novus Ordo. I mean, not all of us, but many, certainly myself. And I'm not his judge, and I'm not trying to, to say he should have known better. It's not my place. I just wanted to point out that he was not available to consecrate Sedevacantis either. Now, in keeping with the spirit of the law, the spirit, mind you, not so much the letter, but in keeping with the spirit of the law, to receive consecration from Bishop Thuc, I submit, and anybody's free to critique this, but I believe it's very reasonable, that it was at least permissible in this case, the 1981 consecrations, to act contrary to church law, okay? To consecrate without the papal mandate, to consecrate even if Bishop Thuc was under excommunication, okay? At least permissible for Bishop Thuc to consecrate Carmona, Zamora, and Delorier. Possibly, it may have been actually morally obligatory, maybe even necessary, in this case, to act contrary to church law. Why? In order to uphold the purpose for which the law exists. Right? The salvation of souls. I mean, that's what the church's law is all about. So I'm saying it was definitely permissible for Bishop Thuc to consecrate these men, and for these men to be consecrated by him, perhaps even necessary. And again, the reason being that the divine law, remember how a few minutes ago we distinguished divine law from human law. The divine law of the salvation of souls, that is the highest law, that is the reason why all church law exists, certainly trumps the human church law, which, let's face it, did not foresee the circumstance, and whose purpose it is to serve the divine law. Certainly when Pope Benedict XV in 1917 was promulgating the Code of Canon Law, he wasn't thinking of complete apostasy, basically, from the faith, and of a false Novus Ordo church eclipsing the true church, and the people left in utter confusion and chaos, and not knowing what to do, and almost everybody practically losing the faith. Obviously, that was not something that the Pope foresaw. And so the human church law, which says you need a papal mandate, you cannot be under excommunication and all of that, this has to be set aside for the higher law, the divine law of saving souls. Okay? It's only reasonable. Again, it's like the children, otherwise like the children staying in the house because they want to obey their mother to the letter, when obviously the mother is only concerned about the safety of her children. All right, so in other words, Pope Pius XII, he was the one who instituted an excommunication for unlawful episcopal consecrations. In other words, for episcopal consecrations that are done without the explicit permission of the Holy See. Pope Pius XII did not foresee the situation we are in now, and neither did Pope Benedict XV, who promulgated the Code of Canon Law. Let us now make the same point by assuming the contrary. Okay? Let's assume for a minute that the two consecrations were not permissible. Okay, that Bishop Thuc was excommunicated, and no, he just couldn't, it wasn't right for him to consecrate these men bishops in 1981. If we assume that for the moment, we have to admit that it leads to all sorts of absurd scenarios. In order to hold the position that Bishop Thuc was not permitted to consecrate Bishops Carmona, Zamora, and Delorier, we would have to imagine a whole list of things. We would have to imagine that God would not want the Sedevacantis remnant to have bishops and sacraments because of one bishop's misdeeds. Because Bishop Thuc consecrated the wrong men in 1976, or, because he made mistakes or he was careless or negligent. And by the way, I'm saying this for the sake of argument. I'm not saying one way or another on this. So we would have to assume, we would have to imagine that God would not want his faithful remnant to have bishops, to have priests, to have sacraments, simply because Bishop Thuc did something wrong. We would further have to imagine that God would want the innocent faithful to go without countless sacramental graces because of a penalty, excommunication, suspension, whose purpose it was, remember the medicinal thing? Whose purpose it was to bring Bishop Thuc to his senses. Remember that? We said the medicinal penalty is medicine, and then excommunication and suspension is a medicinal penalty. Its purpose is to bring the offender back to his senses. So we would have to imagine that God would want the innocent faithful who have really nothing to do with Bishop Thuc's misdeeds or alleged misdeeds. That God would want the innocent faithful to go without all these countless sacramental graces because of a penalty that the Church instituted to bring Bishop Thuc to his senses. We would have to imagine that if we wanted to say that the Thuc consecrations were not permissible. Next, we would have to believe that God would want Bishop Thuc's assumed excommunication to stand in the way of the salvation of souls. Because think about it, who really, in the end, suffers? If this was not permissible, who suffers? Not Bishop Thuc, right? It will be us. It will be the faithful remnant. It will be all those souls that have converted to the faith and have received graces and so forth, have had their sins forgiven. They would be the ones suffering, really. So we would have to imagine that God would want this excommunication to be a stumbling block to the salvation of souls. Furthermore, we would have to imagine that the Pope would want his own changeable human law to trump facilitating the salvation of souls. Right? We would have to imagine that the Pope, Pope Pius XII, for example, would stand there and say, no, doesn't matter, I don't care if those people go to hell, I don't care if they have Mass, I don't care if they have priests. My law rules. Okay? No, that's not what the Church's law is for. Next, we would have to imagine that the Church's law would exist for its own sake and not to help souls. It's absurd. And finally, we would basically have to imagine that the Church's law trumps the divine law, right? The salvation of souls. We would have to imagine all these things if we wanted to say that Bishop Thuc was not permitted to consecrate Bishops Carmona Zamora and de Laurier. Obviously, this is all unreasonable and contrary to the purpose of the Church and the Gospel. So the burden of proof really is now on those who would say otherwise. Assuming Bishop Thuc was under excommunication or suspension to begin with, and that's something, like I said, in my study, I simply presumed, I wanted to presume the worst, because then I figured I'd have all my bases covered, okay? I'm not a canon lawyer, okay, obviously, and I'm not going to get into, these arguments about, was he excommunicated, or was he not, is a doubtful excommunication, that's, I don't know, okay, and I'm not willing to stake, a whole argument on something that in the end might turn out to be wrong. So I wanted to be on the safe side and simply assume the worst case scenario, that he was excommunicated. And finally, I would submit this. If acting contrary, if violating the letter of the law to uphold the Spirit isn't permissible in this case, well, when is it? Right? When is it ever permitted to violate the letter of the law to uphold the Spirit, if not now, when, we're, especially in 1981, when it was just looking very bleak, because, yes, she had Sedevacantist priests, but no bishops. So, that's another important consideration. Next, I'd like to talk about Receiving the sacraments from excommunicates, because this is really very important. Canon 2261, paragraph 2 of the Church's law says, the faithful can, for any just cause, seek the sacraments and sacramentals from one excommunicated, especially if other ministers are lacking. Okay? That's pretty clear. Now, this certainly shows the Church's reasonableness, her leniency, and her mercy towards the faithful. It shows that the Church seeks to remove unnecessary obstacles in the way of salvation. Right? The Church does not seek to punish the faithful for the misdeeds of her clergy. So that is a very consoling thing. Canon 2261, the faithful can, for any just cause, seek the sacraments and sacramentals from one who is excommunicated, especially, but not only, but especially, if other ministers are lacking. Now, I wanted to show you here a quote from Father Francis Highland. He wrote a book in 1928 called Excommunication, Its Nature, Historical Development, and Effects. This is a very important point, and I think one that is very consoling to all of us. And Father Highland says, the solicitude of the Church that the spiritual welfare of the faithful be not impeded by the malice of those to whom she has committed the dispensation of her spiritual benefits is manifested in paragraph 2 and paragraph 3 of Canon 2261, what I just quoted. All right? So this proves what I was just saying, that the Church is solicitous for the spiritual welfare of her children, and she does not want to see that spiritual good impeded by the malice of basically her ministers. You know, if they should be guilty of an offense that results in excommunication, she doesn't want the faithful to suffer because of this, and that is the reason why the Church says, no. The faithful can still seek the sacraments and the sacramentals from those who are excommunicated. Okay? Now, I'm simplifying it a little bit, but that's essentially the true picture. Now, it's also important. A few years ago, I kind of thought that excommunication was the same thing as schism, and so I want to make that point. It's not true, okay? Excommunication is not the same thing as schism. Somebody who is excommunicated is not thereby a schismatic. And this becomes clear when we look at the definition. An excommunication, you remember, is a medicinal punishment that deprives the one excommunicated from certain spiritual goods and benefits, right? He cannot go to Mass and so forth, okay? It's a medicinal punishment on a person. Schism, on the other hand, is the refusal of communion with the Roman Pontiff or with the faithful who are subject to the Roman Pontiff. So, excommunicates can be schismatic if they refuse communion with the Roman Pontiff or the faithful. And all schismatics are excommunicated by the Church's law, but excommunication is not the same thing as schism. And at this point, we've pretty much covered it all. How are we doing? Still with me? All right. I wanted to specifically address now some objections from the Society of St. Pius V and others. Objection number one, and I'm sure you've heard those, especially those of you who have loved ones in the Society of St. Pius V, and of course not everybody who goes to the SSPV, to their chapels is also, card-carrying, hardcore Pius V, anti-Thuc and all that, so we know that, but you may have heard these objections before. Objection number one, the Thuc consecrations have not been proved according to the norms of church law. That's Bishop Kelly right there, okay? And the response, quite simply, is wrong. It's false, okay? And why is it false? Because canon law recognizes as needing no further proof, that which is notorious in fact, and the Thuc consecrations are notorious in fact. End of story. That's really all there is to it, okay? They therefore meet the requirements of church law to allow and require us to accept them. Okay, that's how we answer that objection. And again, you can find all the detail, the nitty-gritty, the footnotes and quotes and all of that in my study, if you're interested. And by the way, the study is available online. You can download it for free on the internet, or you can also purchase a copy from the bookstore here for the CMRI. Objection number 2. There were no witnesses present at the Thuc consecrations who can vouch that Bishop Thuc used the correct manner and form in conferring the sacrament. Right? That is the big SSPV objection. Now, you know what? That's true, but irrelevant. It's true. It's irrelevant because canon law puts the burden of ensuring that the proper use of the sacramental rite on the consecrator, and no one else. Canon 1002. Unfortunately, I didn't bring a copy of the Code of Canon Law with me, but it says right there that it is the duty of the minister, of the one who administers the sacrament. He must make sure that it's done correctly, obviously, right? I mean, who else would? No one else has the obligation to ensure that the consecrator did it right. The Church requires us to presume that the sacrament was conferred validly, absent any evidence to the contrary, once we know the ceremony has taken place. Right? That's what we went over earlier. If there is no such evidence, we are not permitted to doubt validity. Okay? That is the Church's position. And as far as what Bishop Kelly says about witnesses, it's all... It all, I think, originates in a complete misunderstanding of what witnesses are for. Again, it would be extremely helpful for you, if you're interested in this topic, to get that book, Proof of the Reception of the Sacraments by Father Sullivan, published in 1944. You will never read that book and come away thinking Bishop Kelly is right. You will not. And I'm guessing he didn't read it. Whenever the Church talks about witnesses, there's some exceptions as far as private baptism, and we'll get into that in a minute. Whenever the Church talks about witnesses, she means witnesses to the ceremony, not witnesses to, did the bishop use the right holy oils and did he impose hands? Not that, but, witnesses to, yes, I was there. I was there at the ceremony. Okay? That's what the Church means when she talks about witnesses. And Bishop Kelly completely twists and misunderstands that in his book. Then objection number 3. This is one of my favorites. An 1853 decree from the Sacred Congregation of Rites requires, in the absence of co-consecrating bishops, assistant priests at an episcopal consecration to ensure that things are done correctly. The decree, ladies and gentlemen, Reverend Clergy, actually says no such thing. I actually retrieved it from the internet. It was online. The decree merely states, and I could quote it to you, it's in my study, I just don't have it handy right now. But if you'd like me to look it up in the question and answer session, I'd be happy to. The decree says no such thing. It merely states that the assistant priests, when replacing the co-consecrating bishops, ought to observe the rubrics of the Roman Pontifical in the same way as the co-consecrating bishops. That's all that's said in that decree. It was actually, ironically, it was a bishop from Vietnam asking the Sacred Congregation of Rites in 1853, submitted a request to the Sacred Congregation and asked, hey, when in a case of an Episcopal consecration where there are no co-consecrated, where there's only one bishop consecrating instead of 3, and we have assistant priests there, what are they supposed to do? I mean, they're not bishops, right? And the Holy See simply replied, just have them follow what it says in the Roman Pontifical. Just do that. And Bishop Kelly completely misconstrued that, and I think because he probably didn't check the actual reference, he just looked at Father Clancy's book, which, of course I can't think of it right now, I can't think of the title, which makes reference to that decree. Yeah, so Bishop Kelly kind of twists that into, oh no, the assistant priests must check on the consecrator and ensure that he doesn't accidentally invalidate the sacrament. Okay, it's absurd. As a matter of fact, if we go back to Canon 1002, where church law says that the minister of the sacrament has the obligation that the sacrament is conferred validly, well, guess what? The assistant priests aren't ministers of the sacrament of holy orders, okay? So there is no duty on them to make sure that the sacrament is conferred validly. Now, certainly they probably all would do that, but they're not required to. And Bishop Kelly cannot make that into a requirement. It's as simple as that. So much for objection 3. I just got a few more. Objection 4. Just as the church requires witnesses at a private baptism who can testify to the correct use of matter and form, so does the church require witnesses for clandestine episcopal consecrations. This is, again, another objection taken from Bishop Kelly's book, The Sacred and the Profane. It completely false, complete nonsense, okay? And this has a rather lengthy response. I'm just going to read it to you and then I'll elaborate a little bit on it. The response is, this is false. There is no analogy to a private baptism. A private baptism is not a baptism at which there are almost no people present, but one that is conferred in an emergency situation with only the essential rites, only matter and form, right? It is often performed by a layman, right, in a case of emergency. And Father Casimir was alluding to that a few days ago in his talk on the sacraments. Private baptism is distinguished from solemn baptism, at which the pastor uses the full liturgical ceremony in the church. Now, here's the crucial point. There is no such distinction to be found with Episcopal consecrations. Okay, there's no such thing as a private Episcopal consecration, in case of emergency, quick, I need to make you a bishop here, impose hands, rattle off the 16 words, got a bishop, right? No. There's only one way to consecrate a bishop in the Roman rite, and that is by means of the whole full liturgical ceremony in the Roman Pontifical. But quickly, to get back to that private baptism thing, 1 or 2 validity witnesses are required, or at least highly desired, for a private baptism, if the person baptizing is a layman and not properly instructed in how to baptize. This cannot be made analogous to Episcopal consecrations at which only 2 laymen are present, like in the 1981 Thuc consecrations. There was only Dr. Hiller and Dr. Heller there. But anyway, there's no analogy to a private baptism because these Episcopal consecrations with only a few people there are not private consecrations in the sense of a private baptism. Bishop Thuc was the ordinary minister of the consecrations. He was a bishop, and a bishop is the ordinary minister of the sacrament of holy orders. And he was certainly properly trained in how to confer them. In 1981, Bishop Thuc had been a bishop for 43 years. He knew how to consecrate bishops. Okay? Generally speaking, and I think I've already touched on this, whenever the church speaks of witnesses to a sacrament, she is referring to witnesses to the ceremony, not specifically to the validity of the sacrament. And one of Bishop Kelly's fundamental mistakes in his book is he keeps confusing witnesses to the ceremony with witnesses to the validity. He keeps confusing proving that a sacramental ceremony take place and proving that the sacrament was valid. And that is one of the biggest mistakes, and it is the reason why he just concludes a lot of things wrong. The Church herself acknowledges that all of the legal formalities for the conferral of a sacrament only serve to prove that the sacrament was conferred, not that it was valid. Because such validity, again, is presumed absent evidence to the contrary. So, this was really great when I did my research. It was great to find a quote. I forgot exactly who said it, but it's in my study. It was a priest, and he says, even in ordinary times, if everything is done properly, and you go to the diocese and you want to see if somebody was baptized or ordained or whatever, all that proves is that he underwent the ceremony. Doesn't prove it was valid, because remember, that's presumed. Right? You can't prove it, you can only prove that all the elements are present that allow us to presume the sacrament valid. So even if we had, papal endorsement and all these things regarding any sacrament, still doesn't prove it was valid. It just proves it occurred, and the validity is presumed. And objection number 5. The Thuc consecrations must be considered doubtful because Bishop Thuc's mental state was questionable because of his bizarre and inconsistent behavior. For example, consecrating unworthy candidates, flip-flopping on sedevacantism, and so forth. Now, I won't deny that there is, objectively speaking, there was some worrisome behavior with Bishop Thuc, right, considering whom he consecrated. But none of this is sufficient evidence that Bishop Thuc's mental state was so compromised that he was unable to meet the minimal requirements necessary for the valid conferral of a sacrament, because the bar for sacramental validity is fairly low as far as the minister's mental state goes. In order for the Church to presume a sacrament valid, the right manner and form must be properly applied by the minister with the intention of doing what the Church does, right? So therefore, all that is required of the minister in terms of the mental state is that he be so mentally competent as to be able to form that intention. Now, the minimum necessary intention is called in sacramental theology a virtual intention. Okay? And you have this virtual intention when you act with deliberation, even though you may be distracted, even voluntarily. Okay? Our intellect, in other words, must be minimally connected to the action we are performing. And a very great common sense example that most of us can probably relate to is speaking on the phone while driving a car. You ever been wrapped up in a phone conversation, and later on you wonder, oh my goodness, how did I get to my destination? I don't even remember driving. No? I've had that before. All this time, I intended to be driving, let me assure you. I did. It was an act that proceeded from my intellect and my will. I knew I was driving. I wasn't paying attention to it much, but I knew I was driving, and I meant to be driving. That is the virtual intention. Okay? The bar is very low, you can see. You just need to have this sort of intention for having this, the sufficient intention to confect the sacrament. Because this is what suffices for the so-called human act, and I explained that in greater detail in my study. And so therefore, it suffices for the sacramental intention. the sacramental act, the administration of the sacrament, basically just has to be an act that proceeds from knowledge and free will. Okay? So, frankly, there is no evidence that during the consecration ceremonies, Bishop Thuc was not acting from knowledge and free will. You'd have to, if you say, oh, well, I'm not sure, he had the sufficient attention, I'm not sure that his sacramental administration really proceeded from knowledge and free will, well, you would have to imagine then that Bishop Thuc didn't realize he was consecrating bishops. Okay? that's simply absurd. Goodness, we have one more objection. Okay. Objection number 6. Oh yeah, this is a good one. Even if the Thuc lineage is valid, we can have nothing to do with any of the clerics ordained or consecrated in the Thuc line because it is sordid. You've heard that one, haven't you? Mm-hmm. Yeah? No? Where do you live? I'm in Cincinnati, I'm sorry. Okay, well, what's the problem with this objection? Well, first of all, the objection is vague. It's not precise enough. Just what in the world does sordid mean? Right? It's not a technical term used in sacred theology, and but it's very popularly appealing. It works well with a lot of people. You go to the pulpit and you say, the Thuc line is sordid, and then everybody goes, oh, no, those filthy Thuc bishops. Well, the term does not exist in sacramental theology or in sacred theology, so I sat down as I wrote my study, and I asked myself, okay, what could they possibly mean? Well, I came up with 3 answers what they could possibly mean. Number 1 would be that they mean we cannot approach the Thuc line, except in danger of death, because, number 1, the sacraments in this lineage are in themselves defiled. That's one possible meaning of sordid that I could think of. Now, to say such a thing, and this is not, let me emphasize this, as far as I know, this is not what the Society of St. Pius V is saying. That would be horrendous. This is blasphemy, okay? The sacraments are in themselves holy because they were instituted by God as a means of sanctification. Okay? In fact, if this were not the case, we could not approach the Thuc line even in danger of death. All right? And even, if we had a pope again, even he couldn't regularize the Thuc. If the sacraments were defiled, there's nothing the pope could do either. Okay, so this is just one meaning, possible meaning of sordid, and hopefully nobody means that. Okay, so this is out of the question. Now, another meaning of sordid is that we cannot approach the Thuc line because it would be sinful to do so because it would violate the moral law. It would be a sin. Okay? Well, the only way it could violate the moral law is if there were a church law forbidding it, because the reception of the sacraments and the administration of the sacraments is governed by church law, not the moral law. Okay? So if we want to say it's sinful, all right, fair enough. But then they must point to a church law that would forbid us from approaching the Thuc line for the sacraments. And that is really the third possible meaning of sordid, is that we cannot approach the Thuc line because the church forbids us from doing so in her law. To which I say, okay, what's the law? Which law are we talking about? Okay, so my response to that one is the assertion lacks clear evidence. The objector would have to demonstrate this from canon law, and I have not seen the Society of St. Pius V do that, so until they do, I can't respond to it. You hear insinuations may be made or whatever, but what I would like to see is I want to tell them, put pen to paper and write down, here's this law, here's that law, here's how the Thuc consecrations fulfill, these conditions, therefore you cannot approach the Thuc line. That's what I want to see, because I think that's the only fair way to do this, okay? And I want to see it in print with footnotes, and I want to be able to check out the evidence. So until they do that, I think there's simply nothing to respond to. So I would like to appeal to the Society of St. Pius V. Please acknowledge the facts, okay? I'm sure they weren't happy when they all received a copy of my study in January of this year, but I would like to ask them to please respond to these arguments, okay? And I would like them to respond in public and in writing. It's very important. Yes, it must be in writing, because it's so easy to just say something from the pulpit and, nobody can object, nobody can, really do anything about it. I want them to put it in writing, because then they have to prove what they say, and they have to put all their cards on the table. And so the ball is now in their court, and I want to ask them, even if you disagree with everything I just said, am I really being unreasonable? Love my study or hate it, it's not unreasonable. Besides, if these Thuc consecrations are really as dangerous as they claim, why not take the time to respond to the evidence presented? Right? Why not? We all want to go to heaven here. Why won't they do it? And this probably comes as no surprise to you, but to this date, no answer has been received. Not even an acknowledgement. I don't even necessarily expect an answer only a few months, because I know it's a huge document and there's a lot to read and all that, but it would have been nice to get somebody saying, okay, hey, we got it, we'll read it, or we've read it, we'll respond later, or whatever, we'll consider it, because this is all very serious business. It's not a game, and I really don't know how much more reasonable and fairly I can do it. I think that what I've presented is reasonable, and whether they agree with it or not, I don't think anybody can say that it's not worth a response. Okay? I think we at least deserve that much, and if you don't see yourself reading 100 pages anytime soon, you can go to the website, thucbishops.com. There's also a 5-page summary posted of the study, which is also part of the study. Just, when you get a very condensed presentation, just like this presentation here, very abridged, very simplified. Likewise, the summary is just a summary of points. It really doesn't. It's not a substitute for reading the whole study, but it will. I thought it was good to include that in there, because when people read so much text and so much technical terminology, after like 65 pages, they'd be scratching their heads and said, "Okay, what were we saying again?" And so I wanted to include a summary. And I'm going to close before we go to questions and answers. I wanted to close with a quote from Pope Pius XI. And that quote will not need any commentary. In his encyclical Divini Redemptoris in 1937, His Holiness wrote, "To all our children, we make another and more urgent appeal for union. Many times our paternal heart has been saddened by the divergencies, often idle in their causes, always tragic in their consequences, which array in opposing camps the sons of the same Mother Church. Thus it is that the radicals, who are not so very numerous, profiting by this discord, are able to make it more acute and end by pitting Catholics one against the other. Those who make a practice of spreading dissension among Catholics assume a terrible responsibility before God and the Church." Thank you. And now if anybody has questions, hopefully I'll have answers. Yes, sir, go ahead.
It seems to me that I remembered when I was reading the summary, don't you make some point in there too about, as far as the Society of St. Pius V, the bishop who performed those consecrations, there's some real doubt about that they don't want to even acknowledge?
I do not, let me repeat the question because it's being recorded, and you're basically asking me, in my summary, my 5-page summary, didn't I say something about about Bishop Mendez and the consecration of Bishop Kelly and doubt regarding that? Frankly, I don't think so. I don't know.
It was late at night.
Yeah. I don't think I got into that. I don't believe that there is any doubt regarding the validity of Bishop Kelly's consecration, simply because, yes, it was kept secret, but they had their reasons for keeping it secret, and they, as far as I can tell, they proved with moral certitude that Bishop Mendez did in fact consecrate Bishop Kelly, and again, validity is presumed, and not only that, they even each, I think, testified that yes, we specifically can testify that he imposed hands, he said the right words, it's valid. Maybe what you mean is that, I think there was something, I gave an interview in Kathleen Plum's paper, The Four Marks, April 2011. I mentioned something in there where I said, gee, I'd love to have some more details regarding that consecration. Very little is known about it. Yeah, we have the photos and all, but let's be a little more forthcoming. Bishop Mendez was quite elderly. He was very ill. He had just recovered, I believe, from a stroke or a mini stroke. For example, did he go through the entire ceremony, including the Mass? Or did he just do the rite of consecration? And why not? Why should there be so much secrecy about that? And so hopefully somebody from the Society of St. Pius V can just say, hey, what happened, I don't believe Bishop Mendez was capable even of standing at the time, and that's fine. I'm not trying to, lay excessive burdens on anybody. If he was not able to, complete the ceremony standing, then he can sit down. These are extraordinary circumstances, but I would just wish there would be a little bit more information regarding that. Is maybe that what you were...
Could have been that, yeah.
Yeah, because, so I don't believe there is doubt regarding the Bishop Kelly consecration, no. Does anybody else have questions, comments, feedback? Yes, ma'am. Yes, the question is, or the lady was saying that she heard that Bishop Thuc had special privileges, special permissions given by the Holy See to consecrate bishops without papal mandate because of the Vietnam War, you said? Okay, well, I am aware of at least a claim to that effect, and there was also an alleged document out there that Pope Pius XI, and of course this would have been before the Vietnam War, unless you're referring to a different war, but this would have been Pope Pius XI in the 1930s, and then I also heard it was renewed by Pope Pius XII. Basically, when I looked at that, I could not find enough certain evidence of that, and I figured, again, I want to play it safe. Let's just, what if we use this and then we find out it was a fraud or a misunderstanding? I did not want to base any of my arguments on something like that, so I don't know. I simply don't know if that's true or not. It's quite possible, but that, of course, would certainly help our case. But I don't know. I don't know for sure. Okay. Anybody else? I don't even know how long I've spoken. Okay. Thank you, Father. Okay, well, if there's nothing else, then thank you for listening. Okay. Yes, I think, Brother, you were...
Clarification, you said the society would end after the priest deceased or something, and it would remain, the society that Pius V would be a secondary society? I didn't quite understand.
Oh, I'm sorry, okay, and I didn't mean to confuse anybody with this. The Society of St. Pius V, consists of basically the original clergy, and then Bishop Kelly, all his ordinations since 2001 have been for the congregation of St. Pius V. And so what that means is that inevitably the Society of St. Pius V will cease to exist when the last cleric dies, and it will only be the congregation of St. Pius V afterwards. That's all. And that will be, that's Bishop Sante right now is the bishop there, is my understanding. Did that answer the question?
No seminarians, nothing coming up?
Oh, no. They have seminaries, but they will all be ordained for the congregation of St. Pius V. So, yes, and then, okay, I hope that answers the question. Yes, Ken?
The lady was talking about the consecration by Bocelli before he was Pope at the direct orders of Pius XI of Bishop Michael Herbigny, okay, who was given permission to consecrate bishops without a direct mandate from Rome. This is historical fact.
Okay.
And my understanding is that Pius XII himself did the same thing, consecrated the bishops in camera, giving them blanket permission to consecrate whom they wished without a direct papal mandate, all of whom were picked up by the KGB due to the machinations of Montini.
Okay.
And that's, again, historical fact.
Okay, so I just wanted to repeat it for...
So the reason this is important is because Pius XII made the law that without a papal mandate, you were automatically excommunicated, yet he then himself, for special purposes, to have bishops behind the Iron Curtain, violated his own law, essentially,
Okay.
for the good of souls.
Okay, well, I'm going to try to condense that and repeat it for the recording here. You were saying that Pope Pius XII, the very same Pope who made the law that unauthorized episcopal consecrations are punished with excommunication, that he himself, quote unquote, violated that law when he was ordering certain consecrations without
He
papal mandate.
himself consecrated these bishops in the papal chambers without witnesses, okay, and sent them behind the Iron Curtain.
I see. He himself consecrated bishops without witnesses and sent them behind the Iron Curtain.
With blanket permission
Oh, with
to
blanket.
consecrate bishops without a direct papal mandate.
I say he gave those bishops
Yes.
blanket permission to consecrate others without papal mandate and without any further authorization. Thank you. Thank you, Ken.
That's all. There we go.
Anybody else?
There we go. Let's go.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for listening. It was a pleasure to be here. I thank His Excellency and the Reverend Clergy for inviting me and for listening to my hopefully not too long-winded presentation. Let us pray for Bishop Kelly, for everybody in the Society of St. Pius V. And St. Charles Borromeo is the patron saint of bishops. He would probably be a very good intercessor. So God bless you and have a good night.